Good morning. My name is John McAllister. I was born in Zimbabwe. My father was a Scottish immigrant and my mother was South African. I don't remember very much about my early childhood, and so I'll just start at the beginning of my story. The first memory I ever had was sitting on a bed in a small room with a woman cleaning the floor around me. Fast forward from that to driving in a car to my first foster home, and sitting at the table with a whole lot of strangers around me. Me and my sister were together and eating this meal. I didn't really like eating vegetables, so I left my vegetables, and the lady of the house said, "If you don't eat your vegetables, you don't get pudding." So I wasn't used to eating pudding, so I thought I'd better try and eat my vegetables. I just stuffed them up into my mouth and didn't swallow them. I was sitting there with fat cheeks waiting for my pudding, and so moving on, it didn't go down very well. I was sent to a little school down the road, which I hated. I couldn't relate to any of what was going on there. I'd never been introduced to reading or any kind of education, so I wasn't used to sitting in a chair for very long. And when school was finished and I had to walk back to the flat where we lived, I was constantly bullied by other kids because I was a bit strange, So, and that's when I learned to fight and defend myself. So I'd first of all got beaten up by every Tom, Dick and Harry. Then I decided to fight back, and nobody came near me after that. But I just couldn't relate to the place, and I would then not go to school in the mornings. I was given the freedom to walk there by myself, but I just didn't go. And it was... these are just snapshots of my early life. We used to play in the evenings with all the kids in the flat in the park next door, and I really enjoyed that. Every evening, just running around wild and doing the things that kids do. And I had an extraordinary experience one day. I was coming home by myself, and for some reason I decided to let myself down on the outside of the balustrade. And the balustrade was overlooking the courtyard, which was a couple of stories up, and I allowed my body to slide down on the outside of this balustrade, and I sort of hung on, and once I'd got to the bottom of the balustrade, I realized that I couldn't pick myself up. And so there I was hanging, and I tried shouting, but to no avail. There was no one around, and so I thought, well, I'll just let go and take my chances with the concrete down below. And so I let go, and an extraordinary thing happened. I found myself standing up with my hands at the top of the balustrade, and I was able to climb over to safety. And to this day, I don't know how that happened. I can only put it down to some miracle, some angel lifting me out of serious trouble. But I didn't think much of it as a 5-year-old, 6-year-old kid. I just moved on. Another memory that I have of living there was I used to walk past the people next door, their flat, and in the window there was a little silver chariot with silver horses, and I was very attracted by this, and one day I thought I've got to have this thing, and so I sort of reached out and hung on to the window guard and managed to get my hand through onto this object and pulled it over and stuck it in my pocket and walked off. And I forgot about it, so that it eventually turned up in the wash, and they traced the theft back to me. So I had to go to the next door neighbours and apologise for stealing their silver chariot and horses. I was mortified, but didn't go down too well. I think they didn't receive it very well. They just thought, well, that orphan next door just messing us around. Why do we have to have such neighbours? You know, that kind of attitude. But anyway, I got out of there as quickly as I could. And after that, I don't think we stayed there for too long. Maybe they thought, well, this kid is just too much trouble. And so my sister and I were bundled into a car, and destination unknown. We went in this car, and with some two adults in the front that are total strangers. And we arrived at our destination. It was an orphanage in Salisbury, or Harare as it's called now. And we were handed over to the nuns. And my sister went to the girls' part of the orphanage. It was at the top of the hill, and I was with the boys. And I was terrified. I didn't say they were very much older teenage orphans, which were quite aggressive and weren't very friendly at all. And this was very new to me. And they said to me, "Oh, well, you've just arrived, so we have to initiate you into the orphanage, and we're going to hunt you down. We're going to take you out into the forest, and you have to run, and we'll come after you and hunt you down." For a small kid, this was quite a terrifying experience. And anyway, they took me to the edge of the forest. It was getting towards evening time, and so I ran off into the forest, sort of desperate, not knowing where I was, and tried to find somewhere to hide where they couldn't find me. And I found this big log, and I hid behind the log, and I covered myself over with leaves and hoped that they wouldn't find me. And then I heard them coming through the forest, screaming and taunting, and just a whole terrifying mob of these teenage orphans threatening all sorts of abuse. And I remember lying there and sensing such a wonderful peace come over me. I was, as I said, I was terrified, but then suddenly that all changed, and I felt incredibly warm and loved. I don't know where that came from. I couldn't remember any experiences of having someone hug me or being kind to me or anything like that. So this sensation of being loved and being warm and totally without fear just was absolutely wonderful. And I fell asleep there behind this log, and the kids couldn't find me, so they went back to the orphanage, and I must have found my way back to the orphanage. I don't remember going back, but yeah, it was an extraordinary experience in my life. I never had that wonderful feeling of being loved and feeling warm. And so I just got on with living with the nuns, who were very, very strange to me. They had strange, very covered garments with the faces just showing a little square of of face, and with veils, and they were very, very strict, I remember. And I wasn't disciplined at all. I don't think I'd had much discipline in my life up to that point, so we just didn't hit it off, and I was constantly being beaten. And with the ruler, they would have this very heavy ruler, then they would get us to hold our hands out, and they would hit us on the edge of our hands with this ruler, and it was a terrifying experience. So I used to, when I held my hands out, when the ruler was coming down, I'd just move them out of the way, so they would miss, and that would make them more angry, and they'd say, look, if you don't keep your hands out there, it's going to get worse for you. So I reluctantly did that, and I had this excruciating ruler hitting my fingers. So I very quickly learnt not to try and do everything that they said, and not to cause trouble. And I didn't know I was causing trouble, but they certainly thought I was. And I managed to get by just on the fear factor, and to avoiding this dreadful ruler. And that was almost the sum of my education. I remember the singing classes. I really used to enjoy singing, and I really enjoyed going to the singing classes, and tried to behave myself. And I was eventually they put me in the choir in the mass, in the Sunday morning Catholic service, and sometimes I would stand on one of the balconies up on the side of the church and sing with this very unbroken soprano voice for the masses down there. And it was all very, very extraordinary with my little choir boy uniform, and I would often carry the incense and stuff for the priests at the front of the church. And I once dropped the incense and the fire and the little coals and that onto the carpet, and I was severely chastised for that. I think I lost my job as a choir boy, but that was my last memory of that. School was just a blur. I don't think I remember learning anything in the orphanage except singing. And I had a little friend who was an Italian boy with. He had a little stub for an arm, and so when he carried things, he would use this little stub as a hand. He was a delightful little fellow, but didn't have any friends, just like me, and so we gravitated towards one another. And I just wonderful experience of having someone I could talk to. One day, an extraordinary thing happened. Then one of the nuns came to me and said, "Your father has come to see you," and that was extraordinary. I didn't know I had a father or a mother. So I went out to the courtyard and sat there on a bench with my father, and he wasn't very talkative. He didn't have much to say to me, so we just sat there quietly, and he seemed very sad. I remember that. there was no, I can't remember if any conversation happened at all, but he brought a huge bag of sweets and chocolates for me, and a fire engine toy, the first child's gift I'd ever received, I think, and then he left, and I went back to the dormitory with my fire engine, my bag of sweets, which were promptly confiscated by the older kids. I didn't get to enjoy the sweets or I might have had one or two on the way in, but that was it. And the fire engine just disappeared, and I never got to enjoy that. So yeah, that was a memory that also really stood out in my mind as just having this very rather sad encounter with my father. And I had no idea of the background of what had gone on in my childhood. I didn't know where my mother was. And so, life went on at the orphanage. I used to go on the holidays. There was a couple who lived on a farm called Flame Lily Farm in what was then Rhodesia. It's now Zimbabwe. And they used to take me out of the orphanage on the holidays, and they were really wonderfully kind to me, and gave me a horse to ride, and I used to ride around the farm on this horse all day, and just really enjoyed the outdoors. It was a tobacco farm, and the man who ran it, who was the wife of the woman who was looking after me, and was the male version of a male part of the couple. He was a boss on the farm and was very, very angry. Would shout violently at his workers, and was always in a very, very angry, bad mood. So he was quite a fearful person to encounter, but I didn't have much to do with him. His wife was very sweet and kind, and would spoil me enormously, and I really enjoyed going there. It was a highlight of my life, really, and I was rather hoping that they would adopt me, but that never happened. It was just something that I never forget. Riding the horse around. And I remember riding the horse through the mealie field once, and that's corn. Mealies are South African word for corn, and I didn't realise that this horse would want to eat the mealies, so it took us an endless trip going through this cornfield with this horse turning to one side to look for a mealie, and me pulling the other way, and seeing a mealie on this side, and he would turn back, and it just took me ages to get through this field, because he wouldn't move with all his food around him. And one of my memories of riding the horse. I'll fast forward from then. The orphanage was given a free holiday in South Africa, and so we all got on a train and left Zimbabwe for Cape Town, and long train ride. We were stopping very, very often at different stations, and I remember coming into Cape Town over the mountains, and it was the most beautiful sight on the train, my first sight of Cape Town. And we were taken to a place called Simonstown, which is on the coast, which is a naval base, and really beautiful holiday destination. And we were given this this wonderful little home right on the beach, overlooking the beach, and we given this great meal and to welcome us, and it was just delightful. I'd never seen the sea before, and one day I was sitting on the beach, just watching the waves, and one of the kids came down and said, "Hey John, your mother's arrived. She wants to see you." So I was quite shocked. I had no idea I had a mother. I thought I was just an orphan, like most of the kids, without any parents, hoping to be adopted by some kind people. And so I went up and met my mother, and my sister was there, and so my mother spoke to the nuns and said, "Well, can we take the children?" And they said, "Yeah, fine, off you go." They managed to prove that they were the parents, but my mother had since my birth, and that she had got remarried to somebody else, and so we jumped. He had a little Triumph sports car, and we squeezed ourselves in the back, and he drove us back to Durban where they lived, and it was extraordinary, really. It was just, life was changing to such an extent I didn't know. Couldn't grasp what was going on, really. And so we went to live in a little house attached to the factory where my father was an engineer, and we started going to school, and but I realized soon after that this was not the happiest place on earth. I was pretty much tolerated by my parents, and they had serious drinking problems, and so most of the evenings they were drinking wine and getting intoxicated and having parties, and just, it was a very foreign experience to me, and I just hated it. I didn't enjoy it at all. Again, no affection. I just didn't experience any kind of affection. I think possibly my mother was guilty for having deserted us in Zimbabwe, and I just couldn't forgive herself. I don't know. And my father was working most of the time and then drinking the rest of the times. That was my stepfather. He was badly crippled, so he had some terrible birth deformities in his legs, and deformity in his legs, and so he was a very noticeable crippled person. He could walk, but it was obvious his legs were bent, and I did feel sorry for him. Because everywhere we went, people would look and laugh and stuff. But he was very, very intelligent man, very good at his work, and so he managed to hold his job while drinking, while he wasn't working, and so that's what happened. And so I grew up with that, with my two sisters. I had one sister who stayed with my mother when she went back to South Africa from Zimbabwe, and the other sister that was with me in the orphanage. We grew up, and we moved house to the suburbs, got a better house, and started hanging out with the other kids. I didn't have much discipline in my life. I was allowed to do whatever I wanted, really. I sort of grew up, kind of without any restrictions. My parents were keen on drinking, and I was keen on running around and seeing my friends, and so it was a pretty loose life, and I was prime bait for for a very destructive childhood, to say the least. I was smoking quite a lot of cigarettes by the time I was 10. When I was a young teenager, there were sexual experiences that I didn't quite understand, and I had a friend down the road whose mother was very kind to me, and so I spent most of my time at their house. And when the parties got too loud at home, I would climb down the drain pipe and go over to my friend's house and just hang out there. Very often I'd sleep there, and my parents would know where I was. There wasn't much duty of care there going on. But yeah, that was me growing up, and soon, it was more and more girlfriends, more and more sexual experiences that I didn't know how to deal with, and then I was smoking marijuana, and started drinking alcohol on a regular basis, and living on the beach. As I grew up, I started surfing and got in with the surfing crowd, and life was just that. It was drinking and smoking marijuana and illicit sex, and it was I used to suffer these terrible bouts of depression when I was a kid, and eventually my parents decided to move house, and my father, I think he was drinking quite heavily and he needed to change his job, and moved to the sugar mills, and so we went up north on the northeast coast of South Africa to a sugar mill there, and my sisters and I were put into a boarding school, and there it was just the same pattern of kind of reckless childhood, not a lot of schoolwork going on, just fooling around and getting as many kicks as I could from life, but just not functioning very well at all. Serious bouts of depression and not being able to study and learn and focus on schoolwork. Eventually I got to my final year of school, scraping through every year, and failed that year, and I was called up to the army. So I went and did my army training, and then I went back into the world after that and started studying, so that I needed to get a university entrance. And so I went to a small college, and a private college, and trained for the exams, and I managed to get a university exemption, and I started going to university, carried on with the same life, the smoking marijuana, music, and sexual experiences, strong bouts of depression. And I did my first year at university and decided I didn't want to do this anymore. I wasn't a very good student. I hadn't applied myself at school, and I managed to scrape through my first year, but then my stepfather decided he wasn't going to pay for me to stay there, so I had to move off, and I decided to travel, and I went to the gold mines in Johannesburg, and worked on the gold mines to get some money. And when I had enough money to travel, I got an aeroplane to Europe and decided to hitchhike around Europe with a pocket full of traveller's checks and a sleeping bag and a sheepskin coat and a couple of pairs of jeans and just did the hippie trail for a while. It was during the 60s, early 70s, and it was cold in Europe, so I decided to go down to Israel and work on a kibbutz, which a lot of hippie kids were doing. So I hitchhiked my way down to Italy and caught a boat over to Athens. And from Athens I caught another boat to Haifa in Israel and went to the kibbutz office, and they sent me to a kibbutz on the Sea of Galilee, and they had a restaurant there, and they used to sell what they called St. Peter's fish, and they would catch these fish in the Sea of Galilee and they would serve them up to the tourists. And I just worked in the fields picking bananas and dates and different things. I really enjoyed it. And but one day a lot of the volunteers used to have dogs, and they would as pets, just to keep them company. And the kibbutz authorities decided that these dogs were getting out of control, so they decided to round them up and deal with them. And this caused a huge outcry amongst the volunteers on the kibbutz. I mean, they couldn't do anything, obviously. I mean, the girls were all crying because they were losing their dogs. And they tied all these dogs up. They would collect them, round them up and tie them up just outside the places the bungalows where we were sleeping. And I was quite enraged by this. Something clicked in me, and I decided to cut all the ropes that they tied the dogs up with, and so the dogs scattered all over the farm again, and then I had to round them up again, and so I was told to leave and go somewhere else. I was not welcome, and so I did. I went back to South Africa for a while and couldn't really settle there, and decided to go back to Israel and find another kibbutz to live on. I quite liked the idea of living on a kibbutz, and by this time it was 73, and the Yom Kippur War had started in Israel, and I didn't know. I was just hitchhiking around and in Europe and heading towards Israel, and I wasn't reading the news, and I didn't know what was going on, and I did the same route. This time I flew into Tel Aviv from Athens, and found a kibbutz office, and they kind of looked at me rather strangely. They said, "What are you doing here? There's a war on." I said, "Okay." Well, I thought, well, yeah, you're not kicking me out. I just need to get some work and get some shelter and some food, and so they sent me off to a kibbutz up in the north, and I didn't know what was going on, but that was quite close to where the Syrians were shelling the Israelis. And when I arrived, everybody was in and out of the bomb shelters, and they just thought I was a bit crazy. I wasn't Jewish. They didn't know what my motivation was, but I just told them, I'm here to work and to get some shelter, and so I started working on the kibbutz, and the shelling stopped, the Yom Kippur War stopped, and we never got shelled, and got pretty close, but the kibbutz wasn't shelled by the Syrians, and they stopped shooting, and it was a relatively peaceful time. And I started working on the chicken farms on the kibbutz and learning how to raise chickens. But my sort of decadent lifestyle of smoking drugs and doing whatever I wanted, sleeping around, continued. And when I arrived at the kibbutz, they gave me this family to sort of look after me. So I would go every Shabbat evening and have a meal with them, and get to know the kids, and got to know my kibbutz parents, they called them, and the fellow who was looking after me was an artist. He was like an artist that lived on the kibbutz, and he worked there and sold his paintings, and that was his job, bringing in revenue for the kibbutz through his art. And they were very, very kind to me, and it was a pleasant experience. But I was still experiencing very severe bouts of depression, and so the guy's wife, I don't know what prompted her, but I think just my depressive state. She was concerned about me, and one evening when I went for a meal on Shabbat, she gave me a Bible, and I didn't have pleasant memories of religion when I was small, except this one experience that I had in the forest with these kids chasing me, and I somehow linked that to a supernatural experience, and I'd often look for places to pray and experience that again, and I'd go to churches, empty churches, and kneel down and pray, and ask God to give me that same experience that I had when I was 5-6 years old. And anyway, she gave me this Bible to read, and I thought, well, let me. For some reason, I just started reading it from the beginning, and it was amazing. That same experience that I had when I was young started to have those same feelings of being loved and being warm again while I was reading through those pages. And life just started to make sense to me through reading through the Bible. It was just extraordinary. It was as if God was accompanying me through this journey of going through the Bible, and the depression lifted. It was amazing just to not have that. And by the time I got to the New Testament from reading through the Old Testament, I was just very, very excited about what God was doing in my life. I didn't have any religious background apart from the nuns and the orphanage, and so I never was able to relate to that at all. But just reading this Bible, I started to somehow connect with that experience, and I realized that it was God comforting me in that very terrifying incident in my life. And I got to the New Testament, I started reading through and realized that the Son of God had spoken these words, and he claimed to be God, and he claimed to come to the world and to save me from my sins, and to take all my sins away, and take all my guilt and shame away, and believe me, that was a lifetime of sin, and I prayed and read and prayed and read, and I had this enormous relief of being forgiven as I read through the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It was an amazing experience, just reading through and having this repetitive story go through my life, and experience the actual God of the Bible touching my life and lifting the depression. And I got so excited about the principles of the scriptures. And I was by no means stopped sinning. I was, there was a huge pause in my life, but the patterns of sin were still there, and I always had some girl or woman in my life making a bid, and I remember a girl that lived on the kibbutz being very, very interested in me, and invited me to go and stay with her in her house, and it was luxury compared to the little shack that I had to stay in, and she had a young daughter, who's 2 years old, and so I just lived with her as if I was a husband. Not married. I was a Gentile. It wasn't really possible for me to get married in Israel to her on the kibbutz, and none of the conservative members of the community were very keen on me, a Gentile, living with one of their daughters. And in fact, her father, who was a founder member of the kibbutz, threatened to leave if they allowed me to stay on the kibbutz. And the management of the kibbutz came to see me and said, "Look, we understand that you're attached to your wife, and well, not your wife, your girlfriend, but she's a daughter of one of our founder members, and they don't want you to live here with her, and they don't want you to be part of the kibbutz." And there were a lot of liberal people on the kibbutz that wanted me to stay, and they didn't worry whether I was Gentile or not, but a lot of them were not happy with the situation. They certainly didn't want one of their beloved founder members to leave because of what I was doing. And so they asked me nicely to think about leaving with my girlfriend and her daughter, and so I did. I left and went back to South Africa and started working as a carpenter in South Africa. I'd had some carpentry experience in Israel, and so we worked into the city, and we lived in the city, the three of us, and I would go to work as a carpenter, and my daughter went to nursery school and learned to speak Afrikaans and became integrated into the country, and we moved quite a bit, but we she went to different schools, and my wife, we eventually got married. My girlfriend and I eventually got married, and she didn't really understand where I was coming from spiritually, because I was still reading the Bible. It was still really important to me. But what I didn't realize, didn't pick up on through reading the New Testament, was that Jesus didn't endorse marriage to a divorcee, and my wife was divorced to her husband that left her in Israel, and so according to Jesus' commandments, that marriage was not valid, and we were living in adultery. And I didn't realize that. I had, I don't know why the penny just didn't drop from reading through the scriptures. I didn't get a hold of that principle. And I was going to a Methodist church, and the pastor of the church, he didn't have a problem with me being married to a divorcee, and he just he said he would like us to get married, and so we got married. And shortly after that my wife became a Christian, and I used to take my little girl to Sunday school, and she became a Christian, and we got on with our lives, and I found the Methodist Church not ideal in terms of what I'd read in the scriptures, and so I moved to a Pentecostal church and found that very difficult, and I went to a charismatic church, and eventually ended up working for the charismatic church as a building supervisor on a very big property that they had. And but all the time there was no mention of by leadership or anything that I was living in adultery with my first wife, and and so we just carried on, and eventually that relationship became very, very difficult, and my daughter grew up and became a nurse, and left home, and married another Christian guy, and my youngest daughter, I had another daughter, she moved out of the house and married a young man, and had a child, and so I was alone with my wife, and things were very difficult. Relationship wasn't very happy, and eventually we got divorced. By mutual consent, really, we decided it was better for us to get divorced than to be living in a lot of tension. And then for 3 years I lived on my own, and by this time I'd left the charismatic church where I was, and was just wandering, not connected to any spiritual group. I was pretty disillusioned with the church at this time. I didn't know how to relate to it. I couldn't relate the church to the spiritual experiences I'd had, both as a young child and as a 20-year-old in the kibbutz reading through the scriptures. But I know my life wasn't the then as it was when I was on the kibbutz and having those experiences with the scriptures and with this personal encounter with God. So I had a number of years where I just wondered and I couldn't relate to the church, and eventually I moved after we got divorced. I moved to a school. I was teaching by then. I'd got a teaching diploma, and I started teaching in a school in another town on the coast in South Africa. It was a Christian school, and so I hoped to kind of connect with my spiritual roots there, but it didn't work out that way. It was I just couldn't connect with the people there as a Christian. I'd had this experience in Israel, which was nothing like this charismatic church, and the values were different. And anyway, I met another teacher that I was teaching with at that school, and she was recently divorced, and her husband had left her, and we connected, and I fell in love with her, and we got married. And again, the other side of the church didn't have a problem with the fact that I was marrying a divorcee, and that Jesus said it wasn't a good idea because I would be committing adultery. And we lived for 16 years married, and then decided to move to England, where I carried on teaching, and eventually I started training teachers at a university, and my life was not in a good place. I was going to a church, but things were really bad for me in terms of the depression was getting bad again, and I just seemed to have lost that intimate relationship that I had with God many, many years ago. And so eventually I think marriage wasn't working again, and we decided to get divorced again, and and so there was a long period of my life that I just kind of wandering and not connected to the church. I just couldn't identify with what was going on in the church. I couldn't relate to my the dynamic spiritual experiences that I'd had as a child, and so I was very lost spiritually, but still reading my Bible, trying to connect, but my life was just dripped in sin. I mean, I remember starting to watch porn and having all these relationships that were just totally futile and dead end, and just desperate for a connection with God. And I think it was about 12. It's been about 12 years now since I was divorced from my second wife, and I went back to South Africa to see my sisters, and I met my friend's sister, who I used to grow up. I really grew up in their home. Their mother looked after. She was kind to me, and so we started to just hang out. Her husband had died, and she was always very fond of me and wanted to marry me. And still, I had no church. She was a Christian. She was in an Anglican church, and but I couldn't connect with the church. I just was determined to stay out of it, because it just seemed to get me into trouble. I couldn't connect with the theology in the church, and so we eventually we decided to get married, and she was a widow, and so it wasn't a divorcee situation. So in terms of the scriptures, it was okay. I wasn't living in adultery, and but still I was very, very hungry, and started looking on the internet for some connecting voice in the church that I could relate to. And purely by chance I started looking at some Anabaptist teaching, and suddenly that, through listening to their teaching, and praying, I realized that I could relate to these guys, that those spiritual experiences that I had had with the Bible in Israel and as a child, that connection with Christ as a real personal friend, and that just started to resonate, and I just want to thank God that I've found a voice out there in the Christian world that I can relate to, and thought I'd just share that experience with you today. Thank you for listening.